I stood in the dead center of my living room, surrounded by nothing but bare floorboards and echoes. The house I had built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago was completely empty. My phone buzzed relentlessly against the hardwood. I glanced down. 60 missed calls from my daughter Marissa. I did not answer. I just calmly reached down, silenced the device, and dropped my house keys into a manila envelope. Outside, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine shook the driveway as a commercial demolition crew pulled up exactly on schedule. I did not scream or throw a fit when my daughter told me I was too old and frail to join them on their family vacation to Hawaii. I did not argue when she handed me a color-coded dog sitting schedule instead of a plane ticket. I just smiled, wished them a safe flight, and waited for their plane to take off. By the time they landed back home, expecting to walk into the house they thought was theirs, it no longer existed. Before I tell you how I tore their greedy little world down to the studs, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And hit subscribe if you have ever had to teach an entitled family member a lesson they will never forget. The blistering afternoon heat was radiating off the concrete driveway as I knelt in the dirt, wrestling with a broken sprinkler head. At 71, my knees are not what they used to be, but I have never been one to shy away from hard work. I was wiping sweat from my forehead when a sleek, brand-new luxury SUV swerved into the driveway, tires screeching against the pavement. It was my daughter Marissa and my son-in-law Trevor. Instead of stepping out to help me, or even offering a simple hello, Trevor laid on the horn. The aggressive blare echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I looked up to see him rolling down his tinted window, his face contorted in annoyance. "Move your rusty toolbox, old man," he yelled over the sound of the engine. "I do not want your junk scratching the paint on my new lease." I looked at the toolbox, sitting safely, a good 3 feet from his path, then back at him. I did not argue. I just slowly got up, picked up the heavy metal box, and moved it to the grass so he could park his overpriced status symbol. Trevor did not say thank you. He just rolled the window up and parked. Marissa stepped out, typing frantically on her phone, walking right past me without a glance. They walked into my house as if they owned it. What neither of them bothered to acknowledge was that I paid off this exact plot of land 3 decades before Trevor even learned how to drive. 2 years ago, they came to me with a sob story about high rent and wanting to save up for a mortgage. I let them move into my guest rooms temporarily, but temporary quickly turned into permanent, and somewhere along the line, they stopped seeing me as a father providing a lifeline and started treating me like a live-in janitor. That evening, the tension in the dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I was sitting at the end of the table with an empty plate. Marissa marched into the room and callously tossed a crumpled grocery receipt right onto my placemat. "We picked up your special low-sodium meals at the health food store," she said, her voice dripping with resentment. "You owe us exactly $47.50. I looked down at the receipt. They had spent over $300 on imported wine and gourmet steaks for themselves, but were hounding me for my dietary meals while living completely rent-free under my roof. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my worn-out leather wallet. As I opened it, my old, faded credit union debit card slipped out onto the table. Trevor let out a loud, mocking scoff. He pointed his fork at my faded card. "You know, if you just let me manage your paltry little pension, you would not have to count pennies like this. I could optimize your fixed income so you are not a financial burden on us." I paused. The air in the room shifted. I did not react to his insult, but a massive internal alarm went off in my head. Trevor had never cared about my finances before. Why this sudden, aggressive push to get his hands on my pension? I stayed completely silent, pulled a crisp $50 bill from the back of my wallet, and handed it to Marissa. Keep the change, I said quietly. They snickered, thinking I was just a naive, broke old man clinging to his pride. They had absolutely no idea that my meager pension was nothing more than a carefully constructed cover story for my actual wealth. But Trevor's sudden hunger for my bank accounts told me everything I needed to know. The very next morning, the subtle disrespect mutated into a tangible threat. I woke up early to brew coffee and caught Trevor standing in the kitchen, frantically rummaging through the incoming mail. When he heard my footsteps, he flinched, hastily shoving a thick manila envelope behind his back. "Just sorting out the utility bills," he stammered, his eyes darting away from mine. I poured my coffee, acting as if I had not seen a thing, but a few hours later, he cornered me in the living room. His demeanor had completely changed to a sickeningly sweet false concern. He held a clipboard with a freshly printed document and a pen. "Hey, Desmond," he said smoothly. "The clinic called about your upcoming doctor appointment. They just need a quick signature on this standard medical release form to update your file." I looked at the paper. The text was incredibly small, dense legal jargon that looked absolutely nothing like a standard clinic form. "Where are my reading glasses?" I asked, patting my shirt pockets. Trevor aggressively shoved the pen closer to my hand. "You do not need glasses. It is just routine paperwork. Just sign at the bottom so I can scan it over to them before they close." I looked him dead in the eye and crossed my arms. "I do not sign anything I cannot read, Trevor. I will take care of it myself." The fake smile instantly melted off his face. His jaw clenched, and he let out a frustrated huff, snatching the clipboard back and storming down the hallway. He did not realize it, but he had just shown me his entire hand. This was no longer just about a disrespectful daughter and a greedy son-in-law wanting free rent. Trevor was actively trying to secure my signature on binding legal documents through deception. They were plotting something severe, and I knew I had to find out exactly what it was before they managed to pull the rug out from under me. The atmosphere in the living room that evening felt unusually light, almost celebratory. I was sitting in my worn armchair, watching the evening news, when Marissa marched into the room with an undeniable spring in her step. Trevor followed closely behind her, carrying 2 glasses of expensive wine that I had purchased the week before. Marissa clapped her hands together, demanding my attention with a bright smile plastered across her face. I muted the television and leaned forward, feeling a sudden warmth in my chest. For the past month, the tension in the house had been suffocating, but looking at her joyful expression, I genuinely believed we were finally turning a corner. Exactly 4 weeks prior, Marissa had come to me with a glossy travel brochure for a luxury resort in Hawaii. She had talked about how much they desperately needed a family vacation to reconnect and unwind. Without hesitation, I had transferred $5,000 directly into her checking account to cover my share of the expenses. I had spent the last month quietly dreaming about the warm Pacific breeze and the soft sand beneath my feet. I thought this trip was their way of making amends for their recent behavior. I thought it was a bridge being built between a father and his only daughter. Marissa stood in the center of the living room, holding a sleek envelope adorned with the logo of a premium airline. Trevor took a sip of his wine and wrapped an arm around her waist, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Marissa pulled out 2 thick, glossy boarding passes and fanned them out like a winning hand of cards. She started talking about the pristine beaches of Kauai and the private snorkeling tours they had booked. I smiled warmly, adjusting my posture as I waited for her to hand me my ticket. I was already calculating what I needed to pack and wondering if my old swimming trunks still fit. I watched as she handed the boarding passes to Trevor, who tucked them safely into his breast pocket. Then Marissa turned to me. She reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out a thick, rigid piece of paper. She walked over and placed it directly into my lap. I looked down, expecting to see a flight itinerary or a hotel confirmation with my name on it. Instead, my fingers brushed against cold, hard plastic. It was a laminated sheet of paper. I squinted, trying to make sense of the document. It was completely covered in brightly colored highlighter blocks and detailed bullet points. There were no flight numbers. There were no hotel addresses. Instead, I saw strict feeding schedules written in bold red ink. I saw dog walking routes mapped out by the hour. I saw emergency veterinarian contact numbers and a meticulous list of household chores that needed to be completed daily. My mind went entirely blank. I sat there staring at the laminated plastic, trying to force the words to make sense. It was a dog-sitting checklist. It was a chore chart for a live-in maid. The reality of the situation began to settle in my chest like a heavy stone. I had worked tirelessly for decades, building a life from nothing, sacrificing my own comfort, so Marissa would never have to know the sting of poverty. I had paid for her college tuition, her lavish wedding, and allowed her and her arrogant husband to live under my roof rent-free so they could supposedly save for their future. And this laminated sheet of plastic was the return on my lifetime of investment. I slowly raised my head and looked at my daughter. Marissa took a step back and let out a soft, condescending sigh, as if she were a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow child. She crossed her arms and tilted her head. "You know, Dad, we thought about it and decided you are simply too old to fly to Hawaii with us," she said casually. "A 10-hour flight is a massive liability for someone your age, and the humidity on the island would be absolutely terrible for your joints. We just could not bear the thought of you being miserable and slowing us down on our vacation." Trevor chimed in from the background, nodding in agreement. "It is for your own good, Desmond," he said smoothly. "The medical infrastructure on the island is not exactly suited for elderly emergencies. It is much safer for you to just stay here in your comfort zone, where we do not have to worry about you having a medical episode on the beach." Marissa smiled that hollow, fake smile she had perfected over the years. "You can just take care of the house and watch the dogs while we are gone," she continued cheerfully. "We highlighted the feeding times so you do not get confused and forget. Just make sure the security system is armed every night, and bring the mail in so it does not pile up on the porch." The sheer audacity of her words washed over me like a bucket of ice water. The $5,000 I had given her was not my share of a family vacation. It was the funding for their first-class upgrades and luxury excursions. They had taken my money, used it to finance a tropical getaway for themselves, and deliberately relegated me to the role of an unpaid kennel worker. They were leaving me behind to guard the house I owned, while they lived like royalty on my dime. I looked at the brightly colored laminate in my hands. The rigid plastic felt heavy against my palms. A younger, more naive version of myself might have cried. A more volatile man might have stood up and screamed, demanding his money back and kicking them out of the house right then and there. But I did not do any of that. The deep fatherly love that had blinded me to their greed for the past 2 years completely evaporated in that exact second. It was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I realized that my daughter was no longer the little girl I had raised. She was a deeply entitled stranger who viewed me solely as a financial resource to be drained and a burden to be managed. They had fundamentally miscalculated who they were dealing with. I looked up from the dog-sitting schedule and met Marissa's gaze. I did not frown, and I did not raise my voice. I simply gave her a calm, reassuring smile. I told her that she was absolutely right, and that the humidity probably would have bothered my knees. I promised her I would take excellent care of the dogs and keep the house completely spotless. I told them to go pack their bags and enjoy every single second of their beautiful vacation. Trevor smirked. taking a long, arrogant sip of my expensive wine, believing he had completely won. They turned around and walked back to their bedroom to pack their designer luggage, completely unaware that they had just handed me the perfect opportunity to dismantle their entire lives. The moment their bedroom door clicked shut, the frail old man persona they had forced upon me dissolved completely. I was no longer the tired pensioner they thought they were manipulating. I was the ruthless businessman who had built an empire from the ground up, and they were about to learn exactly how I had amassed the fortune they were so desperately trying to steal. I did not scream. I did not throw the brightly colored plastic back in her face. I sat in my worn armchair, looking at the dog-sitting schedule resting on my lap. The silence in the living room stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Marissa shifted her weight from one foot to the other, crossing her arms defensively, as if anticipating a fight. Trevor took a step forward, puffing out his chest, preparing to argue with a frail old man. But I did not give them the satisfaction of an argument. I slowly looked up from the list and let a soft, warm smile spread across my face. I told them that they were absolutely right. I said my old knees probably could not handle the long flight anyway, and that staying behind was the best idea for everyone. I looked my daughter dead in the eye and wished them both a safe and wonderful flight. The visible wave of relief that washed over their faces was sickening. Marissa let out a loud, dramatic exhale and uncrossed her arms. She actually smiled and told me I was being so understanding. Trevor chuckled and patted his breast pocket where my flight tickets should have been. He told me he knew I would see reason and that I was making the smart choice for my health. There was not a single ounce of guilt in their voices. They did not feel bad for taking my $5,000 and leaving me behind. They felt victorious. They had successfully manipulated the old man and secured their luxury vacation without having to drag me along. They turned their backs on me and hurried down the hallway to finish packing their bags, excitedly chattering about beachfront cocktails and romantic dinners. The next morning arrived with a cool, crisp breeze. I woke up early and brewed a fresh pot of coffee, playing my role to absolute perfection. I sat at the kitchen island, sipping my mug, as Marissa and Trevor dragged their massive designer suitcases down the stairs. The heavy thud of their luggage echoed through the house I had built. An expensive black SUV pulled into the driveway to take them to the airport. I walked them to the front door, holding the laminated chore chart in my hand, like a loyal employee receiving his daily orders. Trevor popped the trunk of the vehicle and tossed his bags inside. He turned to me with a smug, arrogant grin and jokingly reminded me not to forget to clean out the gutters while they were gone. He said it builds character and laughed at his own terrible joke. Marissa did not even bother to hug me goodbye. She slung her expensive leather purse over her shoulder and slipped on a pair of oversized sunglasses. She casually reminded me to keep the thermostat turned up so the dogs would not get cold, and told me to make sure the lawn was mowed before they got back. She slipped into the back seat of the luxury vehicle without looking back once. Trevor slammed the door shut and slid in right beside her. I stood on the front porch and offered a small, friendly wave as the driver put the car in reverse. I watched the heavy black vehicle back out of my driveway and accelerate down the street. I kept my eyes fixed on the glowing red taillights until they completely disappeared around the corner. The moment the car vanished from sight, the entire atmosphere around me shifted. The heavy, suffocating weight of my fatherly obligations evaporated into the cool morning air. I lowered my hand. The gentle, confused grandfather persona I had maintained for the past 2 years melted away instantly. The slight stoop in my shoulders vanished as I stood up straight. I rolled my neck, feeling the tension released from my muscles. I turned around and walked back inside my empty house. The silence within the walls was no longer lonely. It was a canvas, waiting for me to paint my masterpiece. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up the laminated dog-sitting schedule. I did not throw it away. I set it down gently, because it was the ultimate proof of their betrayal. It was the catalyst I needed to finally stop protecting them from the real world. I thought about all the years I spent feeling guilty for working late when Marissa was a little girl. I thought about how I let them move in rent-free because I wanted to make up for my past absences. I had blinded myself to their toxic entitlement because I loved my daughter. But sitting on an airplane halfway across the ocean, she was probably laughing about how easy it was to trick me. She did not know that by treating me like a disposable servant, she had completely severed the emotional ties that held me back. I was no longer a grieving father trying to hold his family together. I was a businessman evaluating a terrible investment, and it was time to cut my losses. I walked through the quiet hallways of my home, looking at the walls, the floors, the fixtures. I knew every inch of this property. I knew exactly what it was worth, and I knew exactly how to leverage it. Trevor and Marissa thought they had left behind a helpless old pensioner who would spend the next week scrubbing their floors and feeding their pets. They had no idea that they had just abandoned a ruthless corporate strategist with decades of experience in hostile takeovers and asset liquidation. My mind began moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, calculating timelines, reviewing legal loopholes, and plotting a financial retaliation so absolute they would never recover. I needed to move swiftly. I had exactly 7 days before their return flight touched down. 7 days to completely dismantle the comfortable little reality they had built on my dime. I walked into the kitchen and poured the rest of my coffee down the drain. I did not need caffeine to wake me up anymore. The sheer audacity of their disrespect had ignited a fire in my chest that burned brighter than any anger I had ever felt. I realized that my silence over the past 2 years had been mistaken for weakness. My generosity had been mistaken for stupidity. But the game was officially over. I was going to cut every single financial lifeline they secretly relied on. I was going to strip away the luxury, the security, and the privilege they took for granted. I walked toward the back of the house, heading straight for the room they had claimed as their own. It was time to start uncovering exactly how deep their greed truly went. The house was entirely mine now. The silence was absolute and heavy. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the laminated chore chart sitting on the cool granite counter. The bright highlighter marks mocked me, but I felt nothing but a cold, hollow focus. I decided to go through the motions of their ridiculous demands just to keep my hands busy. I checked the back door to ensure it was locked. I filled the dog bowls with expensive kibble. Then I made my way down the hallway to check the windows. The air conditioning was running high, just like Marissa demanded, but I noticed a warm, humid draft coming from the end of the hall. It was coming from Trevor's home office. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The room was a complete mess of crumpled papers and empty coffee mugs. Trevor always liked to pretend he was a highly successful entrepreneur, but his workspace told the true story of a disorganized and chaotic mind. He had expensive leather furniture and glossy motivational posters, but zero actual discipline. The large window behind his desk was wide open, letting the thick afternoon air pour into the house. I walked around the massive mahogany desk to pull the glass pane down and lock it. As I squeezed past his oversized executive chair, the toe of my shoe caught the edge of a heavy metal trash bin. The bin tipped over, spilling its contents across the expensive Persian rug. I let out a long breath and knelt down on the floor to clean up the mess. It was mostly junk mail, fast food wrappers, and empty envelopes, but as I reached for a handful of crumpled white paper, something unusual caught my eye. It was a thick stack of premium legal paper, partially shredded and hastily torn in half. Trevor had clearly been in a rush before the airport taxi arrived and neglected to run the pages fully through the shredder. The heavy black text at the top of the torn page seemed to jump out at me. I carefully pulled the ripped pieces from the pile of garbage and set them flat on the smooth wooden surface of his desk. I smoothed out the wrinkled edges and aligned the torn, jagged halves together like a jigsaw puzzle. My heart began to pound, a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I did not need my reading glasses to understand the bold uppercase letters staring back at me. It was a drafted legal petition for involuntary conservatorship. My full legal name was printed right there at the top, listing me as the proposed ward. Trevor and Marissa were listed as the proposed conservators. My mind raced back to the morning before, when Trevor had aggressively shoved that clipboard in my face, demanding I sign what he called a standard medical release form. It was not a clinic update. It was a psychological evaluation consent form designed to build a false medical case against my sanity. I stood frozen in that quiet office, reading through the dense legal jargon. The document detailed a meticulously planned strategy to strip me of my legal autonomy. They were attempting to declare me mentally incompetent and completely incapable of managing my own affairs. They claimed I was suffering from severe cognitive decline and posed a physical danger to myself. I read the bullet points, where they had twisted everyday realities into sinister lies. They cited my low-sodium diet as proof of a failing, deteriorating body. They cited my slow walking pace as evidence of neurological decay. They planned to file this malicious petition the very moment they returned from their tropical vacation. Once a corrupt or lazy judge signed off on their fabricated evidence, they would gain total, absolute control over my bank accounts, my pension, and the deed to the very house I was standing in. A profound sense of chilling clarity washed over me. This was never just about a greedy daughter wanting a free place to live. This was never just about an arrogant son-in-law trying to score a free luxury vacation on my dime. This was a calculated, hostile takeover of my entire existence. They wanted to legally erase me. They wanted to lock me away in some sterile facility and liquidate everything I had worked my entire life to build. They saw me as a dying piece of machinery that needed to be salvaged for spare parts. They believed that because I wore old clothes and drove a simple car, I was weak and defenseless. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. For a decade, I had hidden my massive wealth in blind trusts, specifically to prevent this exact kind of parasitic greed from infecting my family. I had lived like a modest pension earner to see if my daughter would love me, for me, and not for my bank balance. She had failed the test in the most spectacular and devastating way possible. They thought they were dealing with a naive old man whose mind was slipping away into the fog of dementia. They thought I was an easy target who would just roll over and surrender. But as I stood in the middle of that messy office, I felt a massive surge of energy I had not felt since my days dominating corporate boardrooms. The frail, tired pensioner they left behind was gone forever. I picked up the taped-together document and folded it neatly, slipping it into my pocket. The betrayal was so deep and so absolute that it completely extinguished any lingering affection or guilt I held for the people who occupied this house. I walked out of the office, pulling the door firmly shut behind me. I had exactly 1 week to dismantle their lives. It was time to show them exactly why I had been able to retire wealthy enough to buy and sell their entire world 10 times over. I did not stop at the torn pieces of paper. The initial shock of the conservatorship petition had worn off. leaving behind a chilling need to uncover every single detail of their scheme. I walked around the mahogany desk and pulled open the heavy bottom drawer. It was unlocked. Trevor had always been too arrogant to think I would ever snoop through his things. Inside, beneath a stack of unpaid luxury car bills, I found a thick leather-bound notebook. I opened it and recognized my daughter's neat cursive handwriting filling the pages. It was not a journal or a diary. It was a daily surveillance log. My eyes scanned the meticulously dated entries. Marissa had been documenting my every move for the past 6 months, but she had twisted my normal behavior into something terrifying. I read an entry from early October where I had misplaced my car keys for a few minutes. Marissa had written that I was suffering from severe memory lapses and exhibiting signs of early onset dementia. Another entry from November noted that I had taken an afternoon nap on the couch after fixing the plumbing. She documented it as chronic fatigue and an inability to maintain basic physical stamina. Even my dietary choices were weaponized. The low-sodium meals that my doctor had recommended for general heart health were listed as a strict medical necessity because my body was supposedly shutting down. The sheer level of premeditation was staggering. My own daughter had been acting as a hostile spy inside the house I provided for her. She sat across from me at the dinner table, smiling and asking about my day while mentally logging my answers to build a fabricated medical case against my sanity. I turned the page, and the true depth of their greed stared back at me in black and white. Tucked between the pages of the notebook were 3 printed appraisals of my property from local real estate agents. They had brought people into my home while I was out running errands to estimate exactly how much cash they could extract from my life. Trevor had written detailed notes in the margins about the newly renovated kitchen I paid for and the new roof I had just patched. He was calculating how to maximize their profit and minimize their capital gains tax once they forced the sale. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. Behind the appraisals, I found a glossy trifold brochure for a state-run long-term care facility. It was not a luxury retirement community or a comfortable assisted living center. It was one of the cheapest, most notoriously underfunded institutions in the entire county. Trevor had circled the monthly cost in red ink, calculating exactly how little of my own money they could spend to keep me locked away. I read the details of the facility. It featured shared, cramped rooms and highly restricted visiting hours. It was a place designed to warehouse the forgotten, not care for the elderly. Right next to that monthly fee, Trevor had written down the estimated massive profit from the sale of my house. They had already divided up the hundreds of thousands of dollars they expected to steal from me. They had allocated funds for a down payment on a sprawling new mansion, a second luxury vehicle, and more tropical vacations, all while planning to abandon me in a sterile linoleum room until I died. A profound coldness settled into my bones as I stared at the brochure. This was not a simple case of entitled children wanting a free ride. This was an active, malicious conspiracy to strip a human being of his fundamental rights. They did not just want my money. They wanted to erase my autonomy, my dignity, and my future. They wanted to legally bind my hands so I could not fight back while they liquidated 40 years of my hard work. The absolute cruelty of their blueprint extinguished any lingering trace of parental sympathy I might have harbored. I realized they were fully prepared to stand in front of a judge and swear under oath that I was a danger to myself. They were prepared to watch strangers pack my belongings into garbage bags and escort me to a locked ward. They were not my family anymore. They were parasites, and they were about to find out what happens when the host finally fights back. I closed the leather notebook and placed it neatly back into the drawer, exactly how I had found it. I did not need to confront them with this evidence. I did not need to scream or cry or demand an explanation. Explanations were completely useless. Now I realized that my silence over the past 2 years had been the greatest advantage I possessed. They believed I was a weak, oblivious old man who spent his days puttering around the yard and watching television. They had no idea that beneath my faded flannel shirts and quiet demeanor, I was a man who had built a massive commercial real estate empire through ruthless negotiation and flawless strategy. I had stepped away from that aggressive corporate life a decade ago because I wanted peace. I had placed my immense wealth into blind trusts to protect my family from the corrupting influence of easy money. But my daughter and her husband had just dragged that dormant, ruthless part of me back to the surface. I walked out of the office and stood in the hallway, looking at the framed photographs on the wall. Pictures of Marissa, as a little girl, smiling in her graduation gown, hugging me on her wedding day. The love I felt in those moments had been real, but the woman in those pictures no longer existed. I reached out and took the frames down, one by one, stacking them face down on a side table. I was wiping the slate completely clean. I had exactly 7 days until their return flight touched the runway. 7 days to execute a financial retaliation so swift and so devastating that they would never be able to recover. I pulled my secure, encrypted mobile phone from my pocket and walked toward the kitchen. It was time to start making the phone calls that would systematically dismantle every single pillar of their comfortable, stolen lives. The frail pensioner they left behind was dead. The corporate executioner had returned, and I was going to sell the very ground beneath their feet. I did not run out of the room screaming. I did not throw the shredded papers across the desk or collapse onto the floor in a fit of despair. Instead, I simply reached out and turned the brass lock on the heavy oak door of the home office. The satisfying click of the lock, sliding into place, was the sound of a heavy steel vault closing on my past life. I took a deep breath and let the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs. The fragile hunch in my shoulders that I had meticulously maintained for 2 long years disappeared completely. I stood up straight, rolling my neck until the joints popped. The transformation was absolute. They had wanted to deal with a helpless victim, but they had just locked themselves in a cage with an apex predator. I walked away from his desk and moved toward the far corner of the room, where a large, heavy potted plant sat over an ornate rug. Trevor thought he knew every inch of this house, but he was completely oblivious to the secrets hidden right beneath his expensive designer shoes. I pushed the heavy ceramic pot aside with ease and rolled back the corner of the rug. Beneath the polished hardwood floorboards was a concealed panel perfectly blended into the grain of the wood. I pressed my thumb against the hidden biometric scanner. A soft green light blinked in the shadows, and a small square section of the floor popped open, revealing a state-of-the-art titanium wall safe. I punched in a 12-digit passcode that I had memorized a decade ago. The heavy metal door hissed open. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a sleek, encrypted satellite phone. It was a device that had not been turned on in 10 years. I picked up the heavy black phone and pressed the power button. The screen illuminated immediately, bypassing any standard carrier networks and connecting directly to a private secure server. I scrolled to the single contact saved in the device and pressed call. The line did not even ring twice before a sharp, professional voice answered on the other end. The man on the phone did not ask who was calling. He simply said, "Good afternoon, sir. It has been a very long time." I smiled, feeling the old familiar rush of power coursing through my veins. I told him it was good to hear his voice again. I told him that my daughter and her husband had just boarded a plane for a week-long vacation. Then I gave the order I had hoped I would never have to give. I told Ellis to immediately thaw the primary blind trusts and begin the liquidation process. Ellis did not ask any questions. He simply typed on a keyboard in the background and asked which specific assets I wanted to release first. I told him to release all of them. To fully understand the sheer magnitude of the avalanche I was about to bring down upon my ungrateful daughter, you have to understand who Ellis is and who I really am. I am not a retired factory worker, surviving on a meager state pension. I never was. Decades ago, long before Marissa even entered high school, I built one of the largest commercial real estate empires on the eastern seaboard. I spent 30 years buying, developing, and selling massive corporate complexes and shopping centers. I fought in the most ruthless boardrooms in the country and built a fortune that most people cannot even comprehend. 10 years ago, when my wife passed away, I decided to sell the entire empire. I walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid assets. But sudden extreme wealth is a dangerous poison. I had seen it tear apart families, turn siblings into bitter enemies, and rot the souls of perfectly decent people. I loved my daughter more than anything in the world, and I was terrified that inheriting a massive fortune would destroy her work ethic and her character. So I made a drastic decision. I hired Ellis, the most brilliant wealth manager in the country, to lock my entire fortune away in a complex web of anonymous blind trusts. I legally severed my public ties to the money. I bought this modest suburban home, paid off the land, and lived completely under the radar. I wore cheap clothes, drove an old, reliable car, and lived on a strict budget. I wanted to see who my daughter would become if she thought she had to earn her way through life. I wanted to see if she would still respect her father, if he had nothing to offer her but his love and his wisdom. The grand experiment was officially over, and the results were devastating. The young woman I had raised to be kind and independent had morphed into a greedy, entitled monster the moment she married a manipulative opportunist like Trevor. They looked at my simple lifestyle and saw weakness. They looked at my aging body and saw an expiration date. They thought they were outsmarting a defenseless old man by secretly drafting legal documents to steal a house that was worth barely a fraction of what I actually owned. The absolute irony of their betrayal was almost poetic. They were plotting to strip away my human rights and throw me into a miserable state-run facility, all to steal a few $100,000, completely unaware that they were already the sole beneficiaries of a multi-million-dollar empire. They traded a kingdom for a handful of loose change. Ellis read back the account numbers over the encrypted line, confirming that the massive financial firewalls protecting my capital were coming down. The dormant accounts were springing back to life, flooding with liquid cash, ready to be deployed. He asked if I needed his legal team mobilized. I told him I needed the sharpest corporate attorneys he had on retainer, and I needed them at my house within the hour. I instructed him to draft the necessary paperwork to execute a flawless, unassailable real estate transaction before the sun went down. I was not just going to cut off their allowance. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire reality, block by block, until they had absolutely nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the luggage they took to Hawaii. I hung up the encrypted phone and slid it into my pocket. The heavy silence of the house no longer felt like an empty void. It felt like the calm before a massive, destructive storm. I walked out of the office, leaving the shredded conservatorship papers exactly where I found them on the desk. They would serve as a beautiful reminder of the exact moment my daughter signed her own financial death warrant. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a fresh glass of ice water. My hands were completely steady. My heart beat with a calm, rhythmic precision. The grieving father, who wanted nothing more than a happy family vacation, was gone. The architect of their impending ruin had officially taken over. and the demolition was about to begin. Less than an hour after I made the call, a sleek convoy of 3 black luxury vehicles pulled into my quiet suburban driveway. They parked in a tight, synchronized formation that immediately signaled serious business. The doors opened, and a team of 5 sharp-looking professionals stepped out into the afternoon sun, carrying thick leather briefcases and portable secure servers. Leading the group was Ellis. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man who had managed my private wealth for over 15 years. He walked up the front steps with a grim look of absolute determination on his face. He did not bother to knock. I opened the heavy front door and let them inside. There were no pleasantries exchanged, and no small talk about the weather or my health. Ellis took one look at the laminated dog-sitting schedule, sitting on the kitchen counter, and shook his head in silent disgust. He knew exactly what kind of people my daughter and her husband really were. He directed his legal team into the formal dining room, and they instantly transformed the space into a high-level corporate war room. They pushed aside the decorative centerpiece and laid out laptops, legal pads, and encrypted communication devices across the long oak table. Ellis stood at the head of the table and looked me directly in the eye. He asked me if I was absolutely certain about the path we were about to take. He reminded me that once we initiated this specific sequence of asset liquidation, there would be no turning back. The financial damage to my daughter and her husband would be permanent and catastrophic. I did not even blink. I told him that I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. I told him I did not just want to sell the house and move away. Putting the property on the open market would take 30 to 60 days. It would involve inspections, open houses, and a lengthy escrow process. That was far too much time. Trevor and Marissa would return from Hawaii and try to tie the property up in endless legal battles, using their fabricated conservatorship petition. I needed a maneuver that was swift, brutal, and completely unassailable. I wanted the house gone before their return flight ever touched the runway. Ellis nodded slowly, a sharp, predatory smile forming on his lips. He completely understood the assignment. He opened his laptop and pulled up a series of local zoning maps and commercial property records. He reminded me of a highly aggressive commercial real estate developer who had been relentlessly harassing the neighborhood for the past 5 years. The developer owned a massive luxury shopping complex just 1 block over, and they desperately needed to expand their commercial parking structure. They had offered me heavily inflated prices for my land multiple times over the years, hoping to bulldoze the property and pave it over. I had always rejected their offers because I wanted to preserve the quiet residential nature of the street for my daughter. I had protected the neighborhood for a family that was currently plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward. I looked at Ellis and told him to get the developer on the phone immediately. One of the senior legal aides dialed the number and put the call on a secure speakerphone. The executive on the other end of the line sounded incredibly annoyed at first, barking about being interrupted during a busy afternoon. Ellis calmly introduced himself and stated that he represented the owner of the corner lot they had been trying to acquire for half a decade. The tone on the speakerphone shifted instantly from annoyance to desperate, greedy excitement. The executive asked if we were finally ready to negotiate a market rate. I leaned close to the mic and spoke clearly. I told him there would be absolutely no negotiations. I was willing to hand them the exact plot of land they needed to complete their parking complex, but it was going to happen strictly on my terms. I laid out the conditions with cold corporate precision. First, the entire transaction had to be completed in cash. No financing, no waiting for bank approvals, and no corporate red tape. Second, the closing process had to be finalized within 24 hours. They would have the title transferred by the following afternoon, or the deal was completely off the table. Third, and most importantly, I required them to waive every single inspection contingency and take immediate possession of the property the second the funds cleared. They would not just be buying a house, they would be buying an active demolition site, and I expected them to begin tearing the structure down immediately. The executive on the other end stammered for a few seconds, completely caught off guard by the sheer speed and aggression of the offer. But corporate greed is a highly predictable beast. The opportunity to finally secure the cornerstone lot for their massive expansion project was simply too good to pass up. He agreed to every single condition and promised to have his own legal team coordinate with mine immediately. The moment the call ended, the dining room erupted into a symphony of rapid keyboard typing and hushed legal directives. My team of attorneys began drafting the ironclad bill of sale. They pulled the original deeds, the property tax records, and the municipal zoning permits. They worked with terrifying efficiency, ensuring that the contract was completely bulletproof. Trevor thought he was a clever businessman because he downloaded a generic conservatorship template off the internet. He was completely out of his depth. My team was structuring a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate transfer that no local judge would ever be able to reverse. Since Trevor had failed to trick me into signing any of his fraudulent medical release forms, I retained full, absolute legal autonomy over my estate. My signature was the only thing required to wipe this property off the map. As the lawyers finalized the intricate details of the cash transfer, I walked out of the dining room and wandered through the house. I ran my hand along the hallway walls, looking at the scuff marks on the baseboards. I remembered the exact weekend I had installed the crown molding. I walked into the guest room where Marissa and Trevor had been living rent-free for 2 years. The room was filled with expensive designer clothes, luxury watches, and high-end electronics they had purchased instead of saving for their own mortgage. They lived like royalty while constantly complaining about the cost of my dietary groceries. I looked at their belongings and felt absolutely nothing. The sentimental attachment I once held for these walls had completely evaporated. A house is only a home when it is filled with people who love and respect each other. This building was no longer a home. It was just an empty, hollow shell made of wood and drywall, and it was currently standing in the way of my absolute freedom. I returned to the dining room just as the heavy industrial printer finished spitting out the final pages of the contract. Ellis carefully arranged the thick stack of legal documents in front of me and handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. He pointed to the highlighted lines at the bottom of each page. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I signed my name with bold, decisive strokes, legally signing away the physical foundation of my ungrateful daughter's entire reality. A courier from the commercial developer arrived less than an hour later, carrying their half of the executed documents and the formal confirmation of the wire transfer. Ellis checked his encrypted tablet and nodded to me, confirming that the massive cash payment had successfully cleared into one of my secure offshore accounts. It was officially done. The house no longer belonged to me. It belonged to a faceless corporation that saw it as nothing more than a future slab of concrete. I stood by the window and looked out at the front lawn. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the driveway. Somewhere out over the Pacific Ocean, Marissa and Trevor were likely sipping complimentary champagne in their upgraded first-class seats, laughing about how they had successfully manipulated the frail old man they left behind. They were probably reviewing their mental notes, planning exactly how they would forcefully evict me into a state-run facility the moment they returned. They were completely and blissfully unaware that the comfortable, luxurious life they expected to return to had just been legally vaporized. They were flying back to a crater. I turned away from the window and told Ellis to prepare the next phase of our retaliation. Selling the ground beneath their feet was only the very beginning. It was time to systematically sever every single financial lifeline they had secretly relied on for the past 2 years. With the ink on the property sale fully dry, I turned my attention away from the physical world and focused entirely on the digital one. Ellis handed me a sleek, encrypted tablet that had been synced directly to my primary wealth management portal. For 2 years, I had purposely avoided looking at these screens. I wanted to live authentically, as a humble pensioner, to give my daughter the chance to love me, without the shadow of my wealth hanging over our relationship. Now I stared at the glowing dashboard with a cold and clinical detachment. The screen displayed a network of offshore accounts, corporate holdings, and diversified portfolios that generated more revenue in a single hour than Trevor had made in his entire miserable life. The time for playing the generous, hidden benefactor was officially over. I tapped the screen and opened the restricted ledger that tracked the specific anonymous disbursements I had been making since they moved into my home. It was time to sever the parasitic lifelines that kept their fraudulent lifestyle afloat. I started with the biggest drain on my resources, which happened to be the absolute center of my son-in-law's massive ego. For the past 2 years, Trevor had paraded around my house, pretending to be a visionary tech entrepreneur. He wore expensive tailored suits to his home office and constantly bragged about his disruptive software company at the dinner table. He belittled my simple life and mocked my faded debit card, while boasting about his incredible ability to secure high-level venture capital. What Trevor did not know, and what my daughter never suspected, was that no legitimate venture capital firm had ever wanted anything to do with his company. His business model was a complete disaster, built on empty promises and terrible management. 2 years ago, when he was weeks away from facing total bankruptcy and personal ruin, I had quietly stepped in. I instructed Ellis to create a shell corporation and act as an anonymous angel investor. I injected millions of dollars into his failing startup, simply because I wanted my daughter to have a stable husband and a secure future. I literally bought his success out of sheer fatherly love. Looking at the detailed ledger, I could see exactly how he had squandered the capital I provided. He used my anonymous investments to pay for lavish corporate retreats, exorbitant executive salaries, and the shiny new devices he flaunted in front of my face. He had built his entire arrogant identity on a foundation of my hidden generosity. I felt a deep, satisfying calm wash over me as I placed my finger over the digital authorization button. I looked at Ellis and gave him a single sharp nod. I pressed the screen and initiated an immediate and irreversible withdrawal of all remaining operating capital from the shell corporation. I triggered a breach of contract clause that we had specifically buried in his funding agreement. With that single digital keystroke, the anonymous angel investor ceased to exist. I sat back and imagined the absolute chaos that would unfold on Monday morning. When Trevor returned from his luxurious Hawaiian vacation, he would walk into his downtown office and find his company accounts completely frozen. He would face bounced payroll, angry creditors, and a massive mountain of corporate debt that he was suddenly personally liable for. His entire career had just been legally vaporized, and he had absolutely no idea. But I was not finished dismantling their world. I navigated to the Personal Asset Management tab on the tablet. Next on my list was the brand new leased luxury SUV sitting in the airport parking garage. The very same vehicle Trevor had aggressively honked at me from the driveway. He had acted so superior, sitting behind the leather steering wheel, yelling at me to move my rusty toolbox so I would not scratch his precious paint job. The supreme irony was that his credit score was far too low to ever qualify for a vehicle of that caliber. He had been rejected by the dealership until Marissa secretly came to me, crying and begging for help. I had quietly co-signed the lease as a silent guarantor, and set up an automated monthly payment from one of my secondary accounts. I navigated to the banking portal and permanently canceled the automated clearinghouse transfers. Then I instructed one of the legal aides sitting across the table to contact the luxury dealership directly. I officially withdrew my status as the guarantor and informed them that the primary lessee no longer had the financial means to fulfill the contract. The repossession protocols would be initiated immediately. They would fly back from a tropical paradise, only to find out that their expensive status symbol had been legally towed straight out of the airport parking lot. I continued down the digital list, hunting for any remaining financial threads they had secretly tied to my name. I opened the transaction history for my daily checking account, the one they thought contained my meager retirement pension. A cold wave of disgust rushed through my veins as I reviewed the recent charges. Hidden beneath the mundane grocery purchases and utility payments were dozens of small, unauthorized transactions. Marissa and Trevor had secretly linked my checking account to their premium food delivery apps and online shopping profiles. They were siphoning away my supposed pension, $50 at a time, to pay for gourmet coffee and designer clothes, all while aggressively demanding that I reimburse them for my low-sodium dietary meals. It was a level of petty, malicious greed that confirmed every single drastic decision I had made that afternoon. They were perfectly willing to drain the last few dollars from an old man to fund their luxuries, while plotting to lock him in a state-run psychiatric ward. I did not bother to dispute the fraudulent charges. There was no need to waste time arguing over a few hundred when I was busy stripping away their entire multi-million-dollar safety net. I simply closed the account entirely. I canceled every single credit card, debit card, and digital payment profile associated with my name. I watched the status bars on the tablet turn from active green to a dead solid red. Every single financial artery they had used to suck the life out of me was now permanently severed. I locked the tablet and handed it back to Ellis. The digital execution was completely flawless. In less than an hour, I had financially ruined the man who thought he could declare me mentally incompetent, and I had permanently cut off the daughter who thought she could treat me like a disposable burden. The invisible shield of wealth I had placed around them for years was gone, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of their own incompetence. I pushed my chair back from the dining room table and stood up. The digital eraser was officially complete, but the physical eraser was just about to begin. With the digital infrastructure of their lives completely dismantled, I turned my attention to the physical world. I walked out of the dining room and made my way down the quiet hallway toward the master bedroom. For 4 decades, this room had been my sanctuary. It held the memories of my late wife and the quiet moments of my retirement. But looking at it now, I felt absolutely no attachment. The sentimental value had been completely burned away by the sheer audacity of my daughter's betrayal. I walked over to the top shelf of my closet and reached all the way to the back. I pulled out a single vintage leather suitcase. It was a beautiful, sturdy piece of craftsmanship that I had purchased on a business trip to Italy nearly 30 years ago. I did not need massive matching sets of designer luggage, like the ones Trevor and Marissa had dragged out to their airport taxi. I only needed the essentials. I packed a few tailored suits, some comfortable casual clothes, my essential documents, and a small wooden box containing my late wife's favorite jewelry. Everything else in the room, the heavy oak dresser, the California king bed, the antique nightstands, meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I closed the brass latches on the leather suitcase with a satisfying click. My entire physical existence had been successfully reduced to a single bag, and I had never felt lighter. Before I could authorize the complete removal of my belongings, I had to take care of the only 2 innocent souls left on the property. Marissa had carelessly commanded me to feed and walk her 2 golden retrievers while she drank cocktails on a tropical beach. She treated the dogs as an afterthought, a nuisance to be managed by the unpaid help. But I had always loved those dogs, and I was certainly not going to let them become collateral damage in my retaliation. I pulled out my secure phone and contacted an elite luxury pet transport service that catered exclusively to high-net-worth clients. Less than an hour later, a climate-controlled, customized transport van pulled into the driveway. 2 professional handlers stepped out carrying premium treats and plush travel harnesses. I walked the dogs out to the driveway and handed the leashes over to the handlers. I had arranged for the dogs to be taken to a sprawling, high-end canine ranch in the countryside, where they would spend the next month running through open fields and sleeping on orthopedic beds. They were going to experience a better vacation than my ungrateful daughter. I gave each dog a gentle pat on the head and watched the transport van safely drive away. The house was now officially cleared of any living creature I cared about. Right on schedule, the heavy rumble of commercial diesel engines echoed down the street. Ellis had coordinated a private, white-glove relocation team, and they operated with the flawless precision of a military unit. 2 massive, unmarked moving trucks parked along the curb, and a team of 20 professional movers filed into the house. They did not ask questions, and they did not waste a single second. I stood in the center of the living room, directing the flow of traffic with simple hand gestures. I instructed them to carefully pack and transport my personal library, my antique furniture, and the few pieces of art I wanted to keep. Everything else was to be immediately donated to local charities or hauled away to the city dump. I watched as the physical manifestation of my entire life was systematically dismantled and carried out the front door. The heavy bookshelves were wrapped in protective blankets. The Persian rugs were rolled up and sealed. The clinking of dishes and silverware faded as the kitchen was stripped completely bare. It was a surreal experience watching 40 years of history disappear in a single afternoon. But I did not shed a single tear. I was watching an exorcism. I was purging the toxic energy that had infected this property ever since I let Trevor and Marissa move into the guest room. By late afternoon, the house was a hollow, echoing shell. The thick carpets and heavy furniture that usually absorbed the sound were completely gone. My footsteps rang out sharply against the bare hardwood floors as I conducted a final walkthrough of the property. The living room, where Marissa had handed me that insulting laminated chore chart, was entirely empty. The kitchen, where Trevor had scoffed at my faded debit card, was completely barren. But there was one room in the house that had not been touched. I walked down the hall and stopped at the threshold of the guest bedroom. The white glove movers had been given strict, explicit instructions to completely ignore this specific space. I looked inside and smiled a cold, satisfied smile. Sitting in the middle of a massive, empty, multi-million-dollar property was Trevor and Marissa's cheap particle board furniture. Their flimsy bed frame, their overflowing trash cans, and their messy piles of inexpensive clothing looked incredibly pathetic in the surrounding emptiness. I was leaving their junk exactly where it was. It was a poetic monument to their parasitic entitlement. They thought they owned this house, but their entire existence within these walls amounted to nothing more than a few piles of cheap garbage. I walked back out to the front porch, just as a white pickup truck belonging to the commercial developer pulled into the driveway. The project foreman stepped out, wearing a bright yellow hard hat and carrying a thick clipboard. He walked up the steps and shook my hand, confirming that the wire transfer had successfully cleared and the property title had been officially transferred to his corporation. He handed me the clipboard, presenting the final demolition permit required by the city. It was the absolute last piece of paperwork needed to authorize the complete and total destruction of the structure. I took the heavy gold fountain pen from my inside jacket pocket and looked at the bold black text on the permit. I thought about the sheer arrogance of my son-in-law trying to trick me into signing a medical release form to declare me insane. He wanted my signature to end my life. I was using my signature to end his. I pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed my name with fluid, decisive strokes. I handed the clipboard back to the foreman and asked him to confirm the exact logistical schedule for the teardown. He flipped to the second page and verified that the heavy machinery would be mobilized over the weekend. He assured me that the massive excavators and bulldozers would be parked on the front lawn by Monday evening, ready to tear through the roof and the drywall at the very first light of dawn on Tuesday. The timing was absolutely flawless. Tuesday morning was the exact precise moment that Marissa and Trevor were scheduled to land at the international airport. They would collect their designer luggage, step into a premium rideshare, and drive straight back to this neighborhood, expecting to walk into a cool, air-conditioned house. Instead, they were going to pull up to a restricted construction zone. They would step out of their vehicle just in time to watch the heavy steel jaws of a massive excavator crash directly through the window of their precious guest bedroom. I thanked the foreman and walked down the porch steps for the very last time. I grabbed the handle of my vintage leather suitcase and opened the door to the waiting town car Ellis had arranged for me. I did not look back at the house as the driver pulled away from the curb. The physical eraser was entirely complete. The stage was perfectly set for their return, and the inevitable confrontation was going to be glorious. 7 days of tropical sunshine and luxury upgrades had left Marissa and Trevor looking like the picture-perfect affluent couple. They sat in the back of a premium airport car service, scrolling through photos of their vacation, completely relaxed and deeply tanned. The driver navigated the quiet suburban streets as the evening shadows stretched across the pavement. From the back seat, they were likely whispering about their plans for Monday morning. They were probably discussing exactly what time they would drive me to the clinic and how they would present their fabricated evidence to a judge. They felt entirely invincible. They believed they had successfully manipulated the system and outsmarted the tired old man they left behind to guard their castle. They had absolutely no idea that they were riding in a luxury car straight toward a devastating financial cliff. The vehicle turned onto their familiar street. The neighborhood was quiet and still, under the glow of the streetlights. But as the car approached the corner lot where they had lived completely rent-free for the past 2 years, something was deeply and visibly wrong. Trevor looked out the passenger window and frowned. The familiar, welcoming glow of the porch light was entirely absent. The massive oak trees were still standing, but the silhouette of the property looked bizarrely alien in the darkness. The driver pulled up to the curb and shifted the car into park. Marissa let out a sharp, annoyed sigh and told the driver that he had obviously stopped at the wrong address. She demanded he pull forward to the correct house, but Trevor did not say a word. He stared out the tinted window, his jaw slowly dropping as his brain struggled to process the impossible scene in front of him. He realized, with a sickening jolt, that the driver was at the exact right address. They stepped out of the climate-controlled vehicle onto the cool evening pavement. The driver efficiently unloaded their heavy designer suitcases from the trunk, set them on the sidewalk, and quickly drove away, leaving them standing in absolute stunned silence. A towering 8-foot-tall chain-link construction fence surrounded the entire perimeter of the property, sealing it off from the street. Heavy green privacy mesh blocked the lower half of the fence, but the top revealed an absolute nightmare. The house was completely dark. Not a single light bulb was burning inside or out. The expensive custom curtains Marissa had demanded I pay for just a year ago were entirely gone, exposing bare, hollow windows that stared out into the night like dead, empty eyes. Parked directly on the meticulously manicured front lawn, tearing deep, muddy tracks into the expensive grass, was a massive, heavy-duty yellow bulldozer. Its steel treads were caked in dried earth, and its enormous hydraulic claw rested mere feet from the front porch, like a sleeping mechanical beast, waiting for dawn. The absolute destruction of the landscape was shocking. Trevor dropped the handle of his rolling luggage and marched up to the driveway gate, his face flushed with confusion and rising anger. He muttered under his breath that I must have lost my mind and hired a landscaping crew without asking for their permission. He reached the thick steel chain that wrapped the two fence panels tightly together. He pulled his house key from his pocket and tried to jam it into the heavy industrial padlock securing the chain. The key did not fit. He flipped it over and tried again, aggressively shoving the small piece of metal against the heavy brass lock. He grabbed the thick steel chain with both hands and violently shook the gate. The loud metallic clanking echoed down the quiet suburban street, but the fence did not budge a single inch. He stood there rattling the gate like a trapped animal, completely locked out of the property he thought he was about to steal. Marissa walked up behind him, her high heels clicking nervously against the concrete driveway. She pressed her face against the cold metal links, peering through a small gap in the green mesh. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She could see straight through the bare living room window. The space was completely stripped down to the floorboards. The expensive artwork, the heavy furniture, the massive flat-screen television, all of it was entirely gone. The house was a hollow, echoing shell. She grabbed Trevor's arm and stammered, in a panicked whisper, that the house had been completely robbed. She frantically looked around the yard, expecting to hear the familiar barking of her two golden retrievers, but there was nothing but dead silence. The dogs were gone. The furniture was gone. The life they knew was completely erased. Trevor stepped back from the locked gate and noticed a bright orange piece of paper, securely zip-tied to the chain-link fence, at eye level. He leaned in close to read the document under the dim light of the street lamp. It was an official municipal notice. He read the bold black text authorizing the total commercial demolition of the residential structure, effective immediately. It listed a corporate development firm as the primary property owner. It was not a robbery. It was a planned, legally binding execution of their home. The color completely drained from Trevor's face. The smug, arrogant confidence he had carried off the airplane evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but sheer, unadulterated terror. The multi-million-dollar safety net they had been sleeping on for 2 years had been ripped out from beneath them in a matter of days. Total panic set in. They were locked out on the street, standing in the dark with nothing but their tropical vacation luggage. Marissa dug into her expensive leather purse and pulled out her smartphone. Her fingers trembled violently as she frantically scrolled through her contacts, searching for my name. She hit the call button and pressed the glowing phone to her ear. She paced back and forth on the concrete sidewalk, listening to the endless ringing. The call went straight to my generic automated voicemail. She let out a desperate, frustrated cry, hung up, and dialed the number again. She stood outside the chain-link fence, dialing my number over and over again, in a manic loop of absolute desperation. 10 calls went by without an answer. 20 calls, 40 calls, 60 missed calls flooded into my disconnected device while they stood helplessly outside an active demolition zone. They looked at the heavy machinery parked on the lawn and the hollow, empty windows of the house. The narrative they had carefully constructed for the past 6 months completely shattered in that exact moment. They finally realized that the frail, confused old man they thought they were manipulating never actually existed. They had tried to build a trap for a pensioner and had unknowingly awakened a corporate giant. They were stranded on the sidewalk, completely exposed to the elements, realizing that they had just lost absolutely everything. I sat comfortably in the plush leather chair of the executive suite, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. The room was perfectly silent, completely insulated from the noise of the traffic 40 stories below. I knew exactly what was happening, miles away at my old address. I knew they were standing on the concrete sidewalk, surrounded by their expensive luggage, staring in absolute horror at the heavy machinery parked on my front lawn. I deliberately let them sweat. I let them panic in the humid evening air for a full hour. I wanted the cold, harsh reality of their sudden homelessness to truly sink into their bones. I wanted them to feel the exact same helplessness they had planned to inflict upon me when they drafted those fraudulent conservatorship papers. At exactly 8 o'clock, I pulled the secure encrypted phone from my tailored suit jacket. I opened the messaging application and typed a single short message to my daughter. I did not ask how her flight was, and I did not ask why she was calling me 60 times in a row. I simply wrote, "Meet me at the Kestrel Crown high-rise downtown, floor 40, boardroom A." I hit send and placed the device face down on the polished mahogany table. I folded my hands together and waited, knowing that those 18 words were about to reel them directly into my trap. I could easily imagine the scene playing out on the dark sidewalk the moment her phone chimed with my text. Marissa would read the message, and her initial panic over the locked construction fence would quickly morph into a twisted, sickening kind of relief. They would look at the downtown corporate address and assume that I had completely lost my mind. The Kestrel Crown building is the most exclusive commercial real estate hub in the entire financial district. It is a fortress of wealth and corporate power. To them, it would make absolutely no logical sense for a retired factory worker to be wandering around a billionaire high-rise long after business hours. Trevor would immediately see my message as a massive stroke of luck. I knew exactly how his manipulative brain worked. He would turn to my daughter and tell her that my mind had finally snapped for good. He would argue that my presence at a random downtown corporate office was the ultimate undeniable proof they needed for their fabricated medical case. They would convince themselves that I had wandered off in a state of severe dementia and somehow ended up downtown. They would frantically call another rideshare, buzzing with renewed, arrogant confidence. They honestly believed they were going to pick up a confused, vulnerable old man and drive him straight to the cheapest psychiatric ward they could find. They thought the demolition of the house was just some bizarre mistake they could easily fix once they had me legally locked away. The ride from the suburbs to the financial district would take them about 40 minutes. I spent that time quietly reviewing the thick stack of documents Ellis had prepared for me. Everything was in perfect chronological order. The bill of sale, the demolition permits, the canceled auto loan contracts, and the terminated angel investment agreements were all resting in a crisp red folder right in front of me. The trap was meticulously set, and there was absolutely no way out for them. The high-rise was incredibly quiet, the evening staff having already gone home for the night, leaving only the executive legal teams and the building security. When their vehicle finally pulled up to the towering glass and steel structure, they must have felt entirely out of place. They dragged their heavy designer suitcases through the pristine revolving doors, completely ignoring the sheer elegance of the grand lobby. Their tropical vacation clothes were wrinkled, and they were sweating from standing outside in the humidity. They marched right up to the marble security desk with a false sense of authority, preparing to cause a massive scene. Trevor probably expected the security guards to be holding a confused old man in the lobby, waiting for his family to come collect him. I had explicitly instructed the night concierge to let them pass without any friction whatsoever. When Marissa aggressively slammed her hands on the desk and stated she was there to collect her confused father, who had wandered into the building, the security guard simply nodded his head. He did not ask them to sign the visitor log. He did not ask for their identification. He just swiped his master keycard to activate the private VIP elevator and pointed them toward the express lift to the 40th floor. That blatant lack of security protocol should have been a massive glaring red flag for Trevor. An ordinary citizen does not just get waved through to the executive penthouse level of a commercial high-rise. But his greed and his absolute arrogance completely blinded him to the reality of the situation. The high-speed elevator shot up 40 stories in a matter of seconds. I can picture them standing in that mirrored box, adjusting their clothes, and rehearsing exactly what they were going to say to me. Marissa would play the role of the exhausted, worried daughter, complaining about how much stress I was causing her. Trevor would play the stern, authoritative caretaker, ready to aggressively scold me for wandering off and causing a public scene. They thought they held all the power in the world. They thought they had finally backed the frail old pensioner into a corner where he could no longer fight back. The silver elevator doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime, revealing the immaculate penthouse level. The floors were polished Italian marble that shined like glass. The walls were lined with expensive contemporary art and rich dark wood paneling. It was a space designed exclusively to intimidate and impress. Anyone else would have stopped dead in their tracks and wondered how a poor old man managed to bypass high-level security and access a billionaire executive suite. But not my daughter, and certainly not her husband. They were so utterly consumed by their own malicious narrative that they refused to see the truth. They stomped down the silent hallway, the plastic wheels of their luggage clicking loudly against the marble tile. They were completely blinded by their own superiority complex. They reached the heavy frosted glass doors of Boardroom A. Marissa did not bother to knock. She did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She simply grabbed the heavy stainless steel handle and shoved the glass door wide open, preparing to unleash a torrent of fake concern and manipulative rage upon the helpless old man she expected to find inside. The heavy frosted glass doors of Boardroom A did not just open, they were violently shoved apart. The thick glass hit the rubber stoppers with a loud, resonant thud that echoed across the cavernous room. Marissa stormed over the threshold, her face flushed a deep, angry red. Trevor was right on her heels, dragging his expensive carry-on luggage over the polished marble floor. They burst into the executive suite like a pair of angry parents preparing to scold a disobedient toddler who had wandered away from home. They had spent the entire 40-minute car ride from the suburbs convincing themselves that I was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. They expected to find a frail, confused old man huddled in the corner of a corporate lobby. They expected me to be wearing my faded gardening jeans and my worn-out sneakers. They were fully prepared to use my presence in this building as the ultimate undeniable proof that I needed to be locked inside a psychiatric facility. Instead, they slammed right into a solid wall of corporate intimidation. The boardroom was massive, measuring nearly 60 feet across, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering downtown skyline. At the very center of the room sat a sprawling, custom-built mahogany table polished to an absolute mirror finish. And sitting at the head of that table, projecting an aura of absolute unyielding authority, was me. I was not wearing my faded flannel shirts or my cheap hardware store denim. I was wearing a midnight blue, custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than Trevor's entire leased vehicle. My posture was completely straight, my shoulders broad and relaxed. I did not look like a tired pensioner, surviving on low-sodium meals. I looked exactly like the man who had ruthlessly built and sold a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire. Flanking me on either side, standing like silent sentinels, were four of the most expensive and aggressive corporate litigators in the state. To my immediate right stood Ellis, my wealth manager, holding a sleek, encrypted tablet and projecting an air of absolute financial dominance. We did not look like a family intervention. We looked like an executive firing squad. The sheer visual shock of the scene should have stopped them dead in their tracks. Any rational human being would have taken one look at the tailored suits, the mahogany table, and the sheer wealth radiating from the room, and immediately realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. But Marissa and Trevor were completely blinded by their own arrogance. Their brains simply refused to process the reality sitting right in front of them. Marissa refused to drop her carefully rehearsed narrative. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me and immediately started screaming. She yelled that I had completely lost my mind. She demanded to know how I had managed to wander onto a secure corporate floor without getting arrested. She turned her venom toward Ellis and the legal team, threatening to call the police and have them all charged with exploiting a vulnerable, mentally deficient senior citizen. She played the role of the terrified, exhausted daughter to absolute perfection. She screamed that I had skipped my medications and that I was having a severe, delusional episode. She demanded that I get up from the table immediately so they could drive me to an emergency medical clinic. Trevor tried to play the role of the stern, authoritative caretaker. He puffed out his chest and marched toward the mahogany table, trying to project dominance. He raised his voice, adopting that sickeningly sweet but aggressive tone people use when talking to a disobedient child. He told me that the fun and games were officially over. He said I had caused enough trouble for one evening and that it was time to go home. He actually reached his hand across the polished wood as if he were going to grab my arm and physically drag me out of the executive chair. Ellis stepped forward, effortlessly intercepting Trevor's path. He did not raise his voice, but his tone was sharp enough to cut through solid steel. He instructed Trevor to take a step back and keep his hands entirely to himself. The cold, professional authority in Ellis's voice finally made Trevor hesitate. He looked at Ellis, then at the four silent lawyers staring him down, and a tiny flicker of genuine confusion finally crossed his face. He looked back at me, sitting completely unfazed at the head of the table. I did not interrupt them. I sat back in the plush leather chair and simply let them yell. I watched the sweat bead on Trevor's forehead from the humid night air. I watched the fake tears of frustration pool in my daughter's eyes. For 2 years, I had bitten my tongue and swallowed my pride to keep the peace in my own home. I had allowed them to disrespect me, belittle me, and treat me like a disposable burden because I loved them. But watching them perform this desperate, malicious theatrical routine completely cured me of any lingering parental guilt. They were entirely hollow. They did not care about my health or my safety. They only cared about securing the narrative they needed to steal my life. I waited until Marissa finally ran out of breath. The echoes of her shrill voice faded against the thick, soundproof glass of the boardroom windows, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Trevor stood awkwardly near the edge of the table, his bravado slowly leaking away as the terrifying reality of the room began to set in. He looked at the tailored suit I was wearing and then down at the pristine mahogany desk. He was finally starting to realize that a confused, wandering pensioner does not accidentally end up commanding a billionaire executive suite. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool, polished wood. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound angry or bitter. I spoke with a terrifying, effortless calm. I looked directly into Trevor's eyes, watching the arrogant light begin to dim. I told him that I had heard he was taking a very sudden and aggressive interest in my financial well-being. I mentioned the grocery receipts and the medical release forms he had tried to force me to sign. I brought up the fact that he was deeply concerned about my meager pension and my ability to manage my own affairs. I slowly reached out and placed my hand on top of a crisp, bright red legal folder resting on the table. It was the only item sitting in front of me. The vibrant red color seemed to absorb all the light in the room. I slid the folder across the smooth, expansive surface of the mahogany table. It glided effortlessly, coming to a dead stop exactly 1 inch away from Trevor's fingertips. "You wanted to manage my assets, Trevor?" I asked, my voice echoing with quiet, absolute authority. "Here they are." Trevor stared at the red folder, as if it were a live explosive. Marissa stopped her fake sobbing and stared at the table, her chest heaving with nervous, shallow breaths. The bait was resting right there, waiting for them. The moment Trevor reached out and opened that cover, the entire illusion of their wealthy, privileged future would be instantly, legally, and permanently vaporized. Trevor stared at the bright red folder, resting on the polished mahogany wood. The greedy anticipation in his eyes was unmistakable. He honestly believed that the folder contained the conservatorship paperwork he had been so desperately trying to force upon me. He thought I was surrendering. He reached across the table, his fingers eagerly grasping the edge of the heavy cardstock. He flipped the cover open with a triumphant smirk, fully expecting to see my signature, legally handing over the keys to my entire life. Instead, his eyes landed on the bold black letterhead of a premier commercial real estate development firm. The smug grin instantly melted off his face. His brow furrowed in deep confusion as he scanned the first document. It was the absolute bill of sale for the property he had been treating as his own personal castle for the last 2 years. He flipped frantically to the second page, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. There he found the municipal demolition permit, complete with the required city stamps and the schedule for the heavy machinery that was currently destroying the guest bedroom he had slept in just a week prior. Marissa leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening in sheer terror as she recognized the address of her childhood home, printed next to the words authorizing total structural leveling. Trevor did not even have time to process the loss of the house before he turned to the third document in the stack. This one was printed on the distinct watermarked paper of the anonymous angel investment firm that had been keeping his disastrous tech startup afloat. It was a formal notice of immediate asset withdrawal and contract termination due to breach of fiduciary duties. His hands began to shake violently. The papers rattled against each other in the quiet room. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He looked up from the documents, his face completely drained of blood. He finally understood that the anonymous billionaire investor who had saved his failing company and the frail old pensioner he had been relentlessly mocking were the exact same person. I sat back in my leather chair and folded my hands, resting them on my lap. I looked at the two of them, watching their entire universe collapse into dust. I told Trevor that I did not lose my mind. I told him that my memory was absolutely flawless, and my cognitive abilities had never been sharper. I explained that I had simply and finally opened my eyes to the reality of who they truly were. I stated, in a voice devoid of any warmth or parental affection, that I had sold the property out from under them in a completely legal cash transaction. I let them know that the new owners were actively tearing the structure down to its foundation at that very moment, and that everything they had left inside was currently being buried under tons of crushed drywall and splintered wood. The sheer absolute finality of my words caused something inside Trevor to snap. The illusion of his superiority shattered completely. He slammed both of his hands down onto the mahogany table with a loud, echoing crack. His face turned a deep, blotchy purple. He began to scream, spittle flying from his lips. He threatened to call the police. He threatened to drag me into court and sue me for every single penny I was worth. He yelled that he would have my legal team disbarred, and that he would personally ensure I spent the rest of my miserable life locked away in a padded cell. He ranted and raved, throwing a massive, pathetic temper tantrum like a spoiled child who had just been told no for the very first time in his entire life. I did not even flinch at his outburst. I did not have to. Ellis stepped forward, moving with a calm, lethal grace. He walked right up to the edge of the table and stared down at the frantic, sweating man in front of him. Ellis reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a second, much thinner file. It was a stark, clinical black folder. He dropped it directly on top of the real estate documents Trevor was clutching. Ellis advised Trevor to lower his voice and choose his next words with extreme caution. He explained that the black folder contained a comprehensive digital forensics dossier meticulously compiled by my security team over the past 48 hours. Ellis laid out the facts with surgical precision. He explained that our cybersecurity analysts had tracked multiple unauthorized attempts to access my dummy bank accounts in the days leading up to their Hawaiian vacation. They had successfully traced the IP addresses and the device identifiers directly back to Trevor's personal laptop and his mobile phone. Ellis stated that attempting to breach encrypted financial networks to steal funds across state lines constituted federal wire fraud. He informed Trevor that the evidence was absolutely irrefutable and currently sitting on a secure server, ready to be transmitted directly to the federal authorities the exact second he decided to dial a lawyer or a police officer. The threat of civil litigation was completely gone, replaced by the very real and immediate threat of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Trevor stared at the black folder, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The loud, aggressive bully, who had been screaming just moments before, had completely vanished. He was entirely neutralized. He looked at the undeniable proof of his own criminal behavior, and the fight instantly drained out of his body. His shoulders slumped, and he sank back against the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, completely defeated. He had tried to play a dangerous game of corporate chess with an absolute master, and he had walked blindly into a flawless, devastating checkmate. Marissa stood next to him, trembling uncontrollably. She looked at the man she had married, realizing that his arrogance had not only cost them a free house and a luxury lifestyle, but had also brought them to the very edge of federal prosecution. She looked back at me, her eyes wide and pleading, silently begging for the fatherly protection she had so carelessly thrown away. But there was nothing left to salvage. The meticulously executed sequence of events had trapped them in a cage of their own making. They were standing in a billionaire high-rise, with nothing to their names but the tropical clothes on their backs and the overwhelming, crushing weight of their own monumental greed. I remained seated silently, watching the total, absolute ruin of the people who thought I was nothing more than a disposable burden. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. Trevor remained slumped against the frosted glass doors, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic failure. The arrogant tech entrepreneur, who had spent the last 2 years mocking my faded debit card, was now nothing more than a terrified man staring down the barrel of a federal wire fraud indictment. He could not speak. He could not move. He simply stared at the black folder resting on the mahogany table, as if it were a physical weight crushing the breath out of his lungs. With Trevor entirely neutralized, the entire gravity of the situation suddenly shifted and crashed down squarely onto Marissa. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her manicured hands trembling violently at her sides. I watched as the reality of her new existence slowly began to infiltrate her mind. The smug superiority that had defined her entire adult life was evaporating right in front of my eyes. The deep golden tan she had acquired, while sipping expensive cocktails on a pristine Hawaiian beach, suddenly looked pale and sickly under the bright fluorescent lights of the executive suite. Her expensive designer clothing no longer looked like a symbol of wealth and status. It looked like a cheap theatrical costume hanging loosely on a woman who had just realized the play was officially over. Marissa looked at her husband, hoping to find some sort of reassurance or a miraculous backup plan. But Trevor refused to even meet her gaze. He was completely broken. She realized in that exact moment that the man she had married was entirely useless. He had no money of his own, and his entire business was nothing more than a hollow shell that I had secretly funded. The luxurious, comfortable life she felt so deeply entitled to had been legally and systematically vaporized, while she was thousands of miles away, sleeping in a 5-star resort. She slowly turned her head and looked back at me, sitting calmly at the head of the mahogany table, her face contorted as she desperately tried to deploy the one weapon she thought would always work against me. She tried to cry. For her entire life, Marissa had used her tears to manipulate my fatherly instincts. Whenever she wanted a new car, a more expensive college, or a lavish wedding, she would simply turn on the waterworks and play the role of the helpless victim. She forced large, heavy tears to well up in her eyes and spill over her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup. Her shoulders shook as she let out a loud, dramatic sob, hoping that the sound of her crying would somehow melt my heart and make me apologize for defending myself. She stepped forward, gripping the edge of the table, and began to plead with me. Her voice cracked as she complained about how incredibly unfair this all was. She completely ignored the fact that she had just spent the last 6 months plotting to strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me inside a miserable state-run psychiatric facility. Instead, she cast herself as the ultimate victim of a cruel and sudden misunderstanding. She sobbed openly, explaining that they had absolutely nowhere to go. She confessed, in a moment of pure panicked honesty, that they had drained their entire joint savings account to pay for their premium upgrades and luxury excursions in Hawaii. They had spent every single penny they possessed because they honestly believed they had a free multi-million-dollar house waiting for them to return to. She cried out that they were completely broke and had no place to sleep tonight. She begged me to call the demolition crew and stop the bulldozers. She pleaded for me to give Trevor his funding back so they could just return to the way things were. She promised that they would take better care of me and that I would never have to worry about buying my own groceries ever again. The sheer delusion required to make those promises, after drafting a petition to declare me mentally incompetent, was absolutely staggering. I sat in my plush leather chair and watched my daughter cry. A few years ago, the sight of her in distress would have caused me immense physical pain. I would have moved heaven and earth to dry her tears and solve her problems. I would have written a blank check to make her smile again. But as I looked at her weeping over the polished wood of the boardroom table, I felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of unconditional parental love that she had ruthlessly exploited for decades was completely bone dry. I did not see a scared little girl who needed her father. I saw a greedy, manipulative adult crying because she had finally been caught in a trap of her own making. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I maintained a cold, steady gaze that completely pierced through her theatrical performance. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my tailored Italian suit jacket and pulled out a slim sterling silver money clip. The room was so quiet that the soft click of the metal sounded incredibly loud. Marissa stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, her eyes tracking the movement of my hands. A tiny spark of desperate hope flared across her face. She honestly believed that I was going to pull out a black credit card and hand her the financial lifeline she needed to escape the consequences of her actions. Instead, I deliberately bypassed my heavy corporate cards and slipped my fingers into the small cash compartment. I pulled out a single crisp $50 bill. I held the green paper between my fingers, feeling the textured ridges of the ink. It was the exact same denomination of money I had handed her at the dining room table when she coldly demanded I pay her back for my low-sodium dietary meals. It was a perfectly fitting, full-circle moment. I placed the crisp $50 bill flat onto the smooth surface of the mahogany table, directly in front of me. I placed 2 fingers on top of the bill and pushed it forward. It slid effortlessly across the polished wood, gliding past the red folder containing the demolition permits and the black folder containing the evidence of her husband's federal wire fraud. The bill came to a dead stop right at the edge of the table, perfectly centered in front of where Marissa was standing. She looked down at the single piece of currency, and the desperate hope in her eyes was instantly replaced by a hollow, crushing realization. She slowly looked back up at me, her face completely pale. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, projecting an aura of absolute unyielding dominance. I told her that the money sitting in front of her should be more than enough to cover the cost of a standard city cab ride to a very cheap motel on the outskirts of town. I instructed her to pick it up and consider it an early cash advance on her final inheritance, because it was the absolute last penny she would ever receive from me for as long as she lived. The finality of my words struck her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. The realization finally crashed down upon her with its full, devastating weight. There was no secret backup plan. There was no underlying parental forgiveness waiting to save her. I had completely and permanently severed the financial umbilical cord. She looked at the $50 bill sitting next to the evidence of their total ruin and let out a broken, breathless sob that was entirely real. She had gambled her entire future on her ability to manipulate an old man, and she had lost everything. Marissa stared at the $50 bill as if it were a physical insult. The quiet sound of her weeping filled the massive boardroom, but it did not elicit an ounce of sympathy from anyone at the table. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a harsh, bitter laugh. It did not come from me or my legal team. It came from Trevor. He pushed himself away from the frosted glass doors and marched toward his wife. His face was twisted in an ugly mask of resentment and panic. He pointed a shaking finger at Marissa and completely unloaded all of his fear and frustration onto her. He told her this was entirely her fault. He yelled that if she had just treated her own father with a shred of basic human decency, instead of treating me like a live-in janitor, none of this would have happened. He loudly reminded her that it was her idea to leave me behind while they flew to Hawaii. He claimed he had always wanted to include me, but she was the one who insisted my old joints would ruin their tropical vacation. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to rewrite history and shift the blame entirely onto her shoulders. He told her she was a spoiled, ungrateful brat who had just thrown away a multi-million-dollar safety net because she could not be bothered to show a little respect. He actually tried to look over at me while he was screaming at her, hoping I would somehow appreciate his sudden defense of my honor. He thought throwing his wife under the bus might somehow earn him a pardon. Marissa stopped crying almost instantly. The shock and sorrow on her face immediately hardened into pure, vicious rage. She snatched the $50 bill off the mahogany table and crushed it in her fist. She turned on Trevor like a cornered animal and screamed right back in his face. She asked him how he dared to stand there and lecture her about respect when he was the one facing a federal wire fraud indictment. She yelled so loudly, her voice echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows, reminding him that he was the one who tried to illegally hack into my bank accounts. She told him he was a complete failure, of a man who could not even run a simple software startup without secretly relying on his father-in-law's charity. The gloves were completely off. All the superficial charm and fake affection that had held their marriage together for the past few years evaporated in an instant. They were no longer the affluent power couple posting perfectly filtered vacation photos on social media. They were two broke, desperate strangers fighting over the scraps of a ruined life. Marissa viciously mocked his failing business, telling him he was nothing more than a pathetic fraud who played dress-up in expensive suits. Trevor fired back, telling her she was a useless leech who contributed absolutely nothing to their household. They tore into each other's deepest insecurities, exposing every lie and resentment they had kept hidden behind their fake smiles. The crushing weight of sudden poverty had instantly shattered their entire relationship. I sat quietly at the head of the heavy mahogany table, simply watching them tear each other apart. Ellis stood by my side, his arms crossed, observing the implosion with cold professional detachment. A few months ago, seeing my daughter's marriage fall apart would have broken my heart. I would have tried to intervene and offer them counseling or financial support to help them navigate their problems. But sitting there now, I felt absolutely no obligation to save them from the disaster they had engineered. I watched them scream and point fingers, realizing that their marriage was never built on love or mutual respect. It was built entirely on a shared sense of entitlement and funded by my bank accounts. Now that the money was gone, there was absolutely nothing left to hold them together. They continued to viciously argue, oblivious to the fact that my legal team was quietly packing up their files. They were so consumed by their own panic and mutual hatred that they forgot I was even in the room. They blamed each other for the lost house, the canceled cars, and the demolished guest room. I looked at the two of them and knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right decision. By stripping away my wealth, I had forced them to look in the mirror and face the ugly truth of who they really were. I owed them nothing more. My duty as a father had officially come to an end the moment they printed out that conservatorship petition. I had given Marissa every possible advantage in life, and she had chosen to throw it all away for a few days on a beach. I watched them tear each other apart for a few more minutes, listening to the ugly truth of their relationship echo across the mahogany table. They were so entirely consumed by their own panic and mutual hatred that they did not even notice when I calmly pushed my heavy leather chair back and stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored Italian suit, feeling a profound sense of absolute physical and mental lightness. I reached down and picked up my vintage leather suitcase by its worn brass handle. It was the only physical possession I had brought with me, and it contained everything I needed to start the next chapter of my life. I did not offer them a goodbye. I did not offer them a final piece of fatherly advice or a bitter parting insult. They had already received exactly what they deserved. I turned my back on the wreckage of their marriage and began walking toward the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive suite. Marissa suddenly stopped screaming at her husband and turned toward me, her eyes wide with a final desperate realization. She called out my name, her voice cracking under the weight of her sudden poverty. She took a step forward, reaching her hand out, as if she could physically pull me back into her manipulative orbit. Ellis simply stepped into her path, blocking her way with a cold, professional stare. I did not break my stride, and I did not look back. I walked right through the open glass doors, leaving them trapped in a prison entirely of their own making. The walk down the silent marble hallway was the most liberating experience of my entire life. The high-speed elevator carried me down 40 stories in a matter of seconds, smoothly descending through the towering fortress of corporate power. When the silver doors slid open, I stepped out into the pristine grand lobby. The night concierge gave me a polite, respectful nod as I walked past the security desk. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the cool evening air of the financial district. The city sounds washed over me, the distant hum of traffic, and the soft glow of the streetlights reflecting off the pavement. For 2 long years, I had lived in a constant state of quiet tension, walking on eggshells in my own home to avoid upsetting my entitled daughter. I had shrunk myself down, playing the role of a weak, forgetful pensioner, just to keep the peace. But standing on that city sidewalk, breathing in the crisp night air, I felt my true stature return. My dignity was completely restored. I slipped into the back of the waiting luxury town car Ellis had arranged for me. As the driver pulled away from the curb, I looked up at the towering glass and steel high-rise. Somewhere up on the 40th floor, 2 greedy parasites were finally learning the true cost of their own arrogance. I closed my eyes and let the smooth motion of the vehicle carry me away from my past. The transition from the heavy gravity of my past life to the boundless freedom of my future felt seamless. A few hours later, I found myself sitting comfortably in the spacious, luxurious confines of a first-class cabin on a transatlantic flight bound for the Mediterranean. The plush leather seat reclined perfectly, accommodating my frame. There were no laminated chore charts waiting for me. There were no aggressive demands for grocery money or fake medical release forms to sign. The flight attendant, a polite young woman with a warm, genuine smile, approached my suite and offered me a beverage. For the past 2 years, I had forced myself to choke down bland, low-sodium meals and pretend my body was failing just to satisfy Marissa's manufactured narrative of my physical decline. I looked at the flight attendant and ordered a glass of their most premium aged whiskey, neat. When she returned with the crystal tumbler, I took a slow, deliberate sip. The rich, complex burn of the amber liquid sliding down my throat was the exact taste of absolute victory. It was a firm, undeniable declaration that the frail, helpless old man they tried to lock away was officially dead and buried. I turned my head and looked out the thick, double-paned window of the aircraft. The massive jet engines roared to life, pushing the heavy plane down the runway with incredible force. I felt the familiar pull of gravity as the nose lifted, and we began our steep, rapid ascent into the night sky. The sprawling city below me quickly shrank into a grid of tiny, glittering lights. I looked down at the shrinking landscape and thought about the commercial bulldozer sitting on my front lawn. By tomorrow morning, the house that had hosted so much disrespect and entitlement would be nothing more than a pile of shattered wood and crushed drywall. Marissa and Trevor would wake up in a cheap motel room with 0 prospects and a looming federal investigation hanging over their heads. They had tried to strip me of my wealth and my human rights, but their own malicious greed had been their ultimate undoing. I took another slow sip of my whiskey, watching the plane climb higher and higher above the clouds. I realized in that quiet, peaceful moment that true justice was not about screaming matches or bitter revenge. True justice was simply removing my protection and letting the natural consequences of their actions finally crush them. I was walking away completely empowered, leaving the heavy, toxic wreckage of their greed thousands of feet below me. The journey from a disrespected father to an empowered man taught me a lesson that forever changed my understanding of family and wealth. For decades, I believed that my primary duty as a father was to provide an impenetrable shield of financial security for my daughter. I worked relentlessly to ensure she never had to experience the harsh, unforgiving realities of poverty or struggle. I assumed that by giving her everything, I was demonstrating the depth of my parental love. But true love requires boundaries, and wealth without accountability is a dangerous, corrosive poison. When you remove the necessity of hard work and struggle from a person's life, you do not create gratitude. You create massive, binding entitlement. I watched my own flesh and blood morph into a calculating stranger simply because she believed my resources were her absolute birthright. She stopped seeing me as a human being and started viewing me as a stubborn obstacle, standing between her and a life of unearned luxury. The most painful realization I had to face was that my own misguided generosity had funded her corruption. I had enabled her toxic behavior by constantly absorbing her disrespect and paying her bills in secret. Realizing this fundamental truth completely shifted my perspective on what it means to truly help someone. You cannot save people who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. When you continue to pour resources into a black hole of greed, you are not being a supportive parent. You are being an active accomplice to their moral decay. The moment I discovered their plot to legally erase me and steal my assets, I knew that the only way to genuinely teach them was to let them fall. Walking away was the most difficult but necessary decision of my entire life. It required me to mourn the daughter I thought I had raised and accept the ruthless reality of the woman she had chosen to become. Letting them face total financial ruin and federal consequences was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of restoring natural balance. I learned that you must never sacrifice your own dignity, peace, or autonomy to maintain a superficial relationship with toxic family members. You have the absolute right to protect your hard-earned legacy and demand basic human respect, regardless of your age or your biological ties. Sometimes the greatest gift you can ever give an entitled person is the harsh, unvarnished reality of hitting rock bottom completely on their own. If you found value in my story of taking back my power and standing up to family greed, please hit the like button. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences with toxic relatives, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute justice.